As a man, how do I date in the modern dating atmosphere? It's really hard these days and super confusing, especially because it isn't like it used to be even 20 years ago. That's an amazing question. And it really is not like it used to be anymore. I've had experience in the dating world. I've had experience online. I talk to people and I have friends in various areas. I'm obviously not married yet. And so for me, in my current position, it's like I can talk to people and it's fine. It doesn't matter. So I've had experience all across the board with this. And it gets really difficult. When I go and I talk to a girl, I'm like, oof, this girl doesn't quite embody, or she doesn't seem yet like she's embodying what I want inside of my wife. And so it becomes difficult when we're trying to look at how am I approaching dating with the things I'm looking for versus what I'm seeing out there in the marketplace, quote unquote. And that becomes a very difficult question. It really does. But there are a couple things we can do, okay? And right now everyone right now really wants to go back to what you're saying, even way back past 20 years ago. They want to go to 70 years ago, 100 years ago, where you see all the paintings of the happy people and it's the dad and the mom in the cute dress with the high heels. Everyone looks like Marilyn Monroe, and their dad's coming home in a suit and tie from his day job to the little house with the picket fence and the dog and the two kids. That's what people want these days. That's what Gen Z wants, and there's all these waves and movements for that. And I think that's good, but I also think it's bad. I think it's good that they want those things, and I think it's bad how they're approaching it. And I'm not gonna get into those reasons right now, but I do have a couple things to say about it. When I think of this question, there are a couple things that come to mind. And the first thing is that, gender roles are something that are important because God made them, literally, biologically. I'm not going to argue with anyone on it because there's no reason to argue about it. And so to try and abandon what God created is to literally abandon everything, including your common sense. And maybe common sense was the first thing out the window, but we need to come back to these things and look at them and say, how is this healthy for us and how did it benefit us before? Because it was natural versus what we're trying to construct ourselves right now. And we know man-made stuff doesn't last. We literally live right now in the West in a there's this thing going around right now. It's this crazy question. It's like, hey babe, how many times do you think about the Roman Empire? These TikTok girls are asking their husbands, boyfriends, whatevers. And the answers are always surprising because it's like, oh wow, you actually think about this. Personally, I think about it quite a bit. And here's why. 3 reasons. I think about it for 3 reasons. A, from where we come from religiously. B, where we come from as a culture. And, are there 3 reasons? It's where we come from, period. And so we need to understand history to understand our culture and to understand the religious stuff, all of those aspects, context, culture, and religion. And so if I'm looking at these things and I say, the context is kind of like the combination of the culture and the religion. But we still have Roman Catholics. People came here to America to escape that exact thing back over there in England. But what happened was England is just the extension of Rome to begin with. If you go back and read medieval history, I studied it extensively for a year, many years. And then this is so funny. I studied this stuff for so long. And then I was a madman. If you came in here, there was stuff, I was really on a rabbit trail for a book I'm writing that really needs to be used and created for this generation and for where we live right now. But everywhere you went inside of this room was sticky notes and books just lying open everywhere. The tabs on my browser, the amounts of documents I had created where I was filing and organizing things. It was crazy. And then my grandmother comes to stay for a while and she brings this book with her. And she opens to this one chapter because it was relevant to what we were talking about. And I go through and I read this chapter and I'm like, this is literally the past 2 years of my life in a couple pages. What? Where did this come from? And so, but we see that we come from this post-Roman society. And my point in all of that is, we see the Roman culture failing over and over and over again. They come, they take over, they oppress, and then things change. And things change for the worse. It always falls down. The pride rises and then they get sacked, the sack of Rome, right? It was a peak time, and then that's the same approach that people are taking inside of dating right now. We see these things happening over and over and over again, and history repeats itself, and we need to say, stop. Let's actually figure this out for a second, because there's a lot of stuff that is happening inside of our modern spheres, all the transitions. I'm thinking specifically right now, Sodom and Gomorrah got burned, but it just got completely destroyed. So with culture always trying to change stuff from where we come from, understanding where we come from, this movement of ever westward moving Romanism is what we live with. We're seeing that right now, and it's affecting the culture and it's affecting our lives. And we're living in a lot of those kinds of things that the apostles were addressing in the New Testament after Jesus lived, and that Jesus was addressing while he lived, and that John was addressing before Jesus began his public ministry. It's all these things, and the Romans were present for all of that from the time Jesus was born, before Jesus was born. And we see that there was all of this craziness, and we need to cut it out, because when we go back to what's actually true, what's actually real, we see that this bolstering of our own human ideas that always flop and always fail, just like the Roman Empire does, it doesn't work, and we need to go back to what does work. Well, what does work? The Bible works. And if the Bible works, why would we not just stick with that? Because that's what was before, it's what still is, and it's what will be. And so it makes so much more sense to just stay with the Bible than to stray from it. And people argue about this stuff all the time, but I'll give you examples right here. We're told, husbands, love your wives as you love yourself. Wives, respect your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Women need love. They need to feel loved. They need to feel valued, valuable. They need to feel respected for who they are as a beautiful creation of God. Wives, respect your husbands. Men need respect. They just need respect from a beginning standpoint that then they can build on and build off of. They have the baseline respect, and women have the baseline love. And then we build these things, and that builds us up together and makes it better for everyone. And ultimately, it's supposed to be the triangle with Christ on the bottom. Christ is why we naturally love women for just what they are, and Christ is why we naturally respect men for what they are. And so those two things, love and respect for the two genders that there are the bases of these gender roles. And we see that playing into the types of work that women prefer versus men. We see that playing into the roles that they fill in the household. Now, how do we actually fix the problem of the people who don't want to be inside of these traditional gender roles? That's a very big question. And I think that the best thing you can do is to really just spend time with the person and feel it out. Because if you see you're probably not going, I don't encourage you to go and date someone who doesn't already have a lot of potential for the type of life that you want to live as a man of God inside of the church, who wants to embrace more of these biblically traditional gender roles and not these Roman ideas and of these evolving ideas of gender roles. Like I was saying with the Marilyn Monroe style gender roles. When you think of that stuff, that's what pops to mind. That's the style, that's the outfit, the uniform, the time period that comes to mind. But that was a golden era, and that is more of like a Roman coming from where we had just crushed and dominated in World War II. A very Roman thing to do. And that is what was happening after that. And so that's a wrong idea. What we need to look at is what happened biblically. And biblically, back in the ancient days, it was much more generational, not this idea of the dad is like the oldest, and then the mom is here, and then the kids go away, dad and mom die off, and you don't really care about them, or grandparents especially, and then these kids split up because they're all living their own lives, and so you just have this crazy maze of people getting split apart and disconnected, instead of actually living for each other and for Christ. They're all living for themselves. And so it's still an idea of, I'm living for myself, and I'm living in this very specific way, which is still prideful. It's saying, look at me and the gender role I'm fulfilling here. And there's nothing wrong with fulfilling the gender roles, but it is that attitude that comes with those things. Like, you see it all over TikTok, all over Instagram. Those are the things that we need to avoid. And instead, we need to do these things, and we need to do them quietly. We can talk about it openly, but then when we're doing it, we don't need to be like flaunting it everywhere, because that just creates more problems and more confusion. What we need to be doing is having honest, open conversations about it and explaining the reasons behind why, where it comes from, because I think this is a very wrong way of approaching it. Instead, it needs to be approached biblically instead of what we see as a rose-colored glasses, idealized, romanticized, and fantasy version of literally just a bygone era. Not all the bygone eras were great, because just before that, during World War II, I'm sure you didn't want to live there, especially in Germany and in other places where the Jews were being killed all the time. You're not romanticizing that era, so stop romanticizing the era that comes just after it. And of course it's going to be nice because you're just fresh off of this massive victory, and that's great. They were not having fun with it. The guys that lost, no fun. We need to stop with the World War II idea of and the Roman idea and the fantasized version of these gender roles. And we need to go back to these biblical versions of the gender roles. Because if we don't, things are going to get really bad really fast. Because you're not actually going to be able to sustain it. It's just going to continue the cycle. The Roman cycle is going to continue. It builds up, then it crashes to the ground. And then they move and go explore new territory. And they build up there and it crashes to the ground and they move and explore new territory. Sodom and Gomorrah, what do you think happened? It built up, they peaked with their pride, and then it crashed down. Literally fire from heaven kind of crashing down. And that is what we don't want to happen here. So in order to not crash down again, we need to be able to have the clarity to say, let's do this in a historically proven way instead of a generationally fantasized and romanticized way, where this was just one generation. We're completely romanticizing what life actually was like, what it looked like, and instead we need to do what was tried, proven, and works, and is biblically commanded for us. We see respecting your elders, listening to the people who are older than you inside of the Bible. That's very important. The people who didn't listen to the prophets did not live great lives. When David did listen to the prophet, though, it was amazing. He listened when he came to David after David's adultery with Bathsheba, and that was the very difference between that and the other incidences in the Bible where they're not listening to God. God said, I don't think you guys should have a king, and still they wanted a king because they saw what was going on around them in that one time frame, the one little piece of history. And kings have been around forever. But what they saw did not last because they were looking at it in the small scale, in the way that they wanted to look at it, instead of in the way God was objectively looking at it and had already told them. He told them, you don't need a king. You have me. That's what makes you different from the other people. So don't try and live the way that the other people are living, because that's being in the world and being of it. You're in the world, but you are not to be of the world. You're to be transformed and to renewed. You're to be transformed and renewed in your mind and in the way that you do things. We live in a post-Old Testament world. We're living in the New Testament world. But now we actually need to make sure that we're remembering the lessons from that time period. So it was a very long, that was very long, but I hope that makes sense, because that is really what needs to happen. We need to stop living in this Roman romanticized idea of what life should be like, which is always their downfall and always what ends up collapsing. And instead, and I could go on forever about those kinds of things, and instead we need to be living the life that we're actually called to live as Christians. And so my point with all of that is to make sure that you are looking for someone who wants to live the life. Gender roles are good, but make sure that they're living the life of the biblical gender roles instead of the Roman gender roles, instead of this idea of let's do this one thing in this one way that we're glorifying because we're so sick of the other way. We went far this way with it, and now we want to go far, I don't care, left or right, whatever. My point is that we went really far one way with it, and now they're trying to bring it really far this way with it instead of just having it be in the middle. I'm okay with things and having flexibility as long as it works for you and it works inside of what God is saying. This is one area where it's not so important that everything is like you're wearing the dress, you're walking the walk, those things where super strict, or it has to be one way where father and son work the farm and the mom is at home all day. But as long as you are actually doing what the Bible talks about, that is the better way of doing things, because otherwise we're going to lose ourselves to this idea of always separating the families, because that's a separate life, right? Father is only home in the evenings to eat dinner with his children. Otherwise he's gone all day and he wakes up early, and mother is always busy and preoccupied, doesn't have time to actually care for the children because she is busy doing whatever. And I understand that not everyone's going to have the option to homeschool going forward. We're all young right now, but these are the things we need to keep in mind as we go forwards. What do we want our life in the future to look like? And that's going to determine what kind of girl we date, because she will have the potential, if we're interested in her, beyond just her physical attraction, she will have the potential to be the person to engage in the biblical way of raising kids and in the biblical way of living and respecting the husband, and the husband respecting the wife and her, that dynamic that needs to happen between those two so that they can better the kiddos. That is what you should focus on way more than just finding someone who walks around in a cute dress all day. It's just that simple.